President, Congress, Zita Holbourne, PCS, speaking in support of motion 4. PCS, like other unions here, have members who lived in Grenfell Tower and who are now displaced, and members who lost loved ones, and our hearts are with all. We should quite rightly pay tribute to the emergency services and public sector workers, including members of PCS, who responded to the fire and in the aftermath, but we must also acknowledge and thank the local community who immediately stepped up to provide practical and emotional support to survivors and families, and who continue to provide that support. Since the fire, I've been working with survivors, those who have lost loved ones, local residents and community. Residents of Grenfell Tower have repeatedly raised a broad range of health and safety concerns with TMO and the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. They were not just ignored, but some residents were threatened with legal action in an attempt to silence them. They died in the fire. Whilst the government has been self-congratulatory since the fire, the account of what has been provided is very different to the account from those who are impacted. Austerity and cuts have amplified the discrimination that already existed in access to social housing and deepened poverty and housing inequality. It's an established fact that BME children live in the highest floors of tower blocks, and we know that there was a disproportionate number of black and minority ethnic families with babies and young children, disabled people and elderly people living on the highest floors and less able to escape. The cheaper and more flammable cladding used on Grenfell has now been identified as used on many other tower blocks, including the tower block I once lived in with my young child. Whilst austerity and cuts have impacted, we should not forget that Kensington and Chelsea is one of the wealthiest boroughs not just in the UK but in Europe, and that there's a complete disparity between working class and wealthy residents in the borough. It's disgraceful, given the wealth of that borough, that its leadership has failed to permanently house the vast majority of the 158 displaced families 3 months on. The post-traumatic stress and depression experienced has really impacted on survivors, but also the wider community. And there's been no offers made. There's been a whole host of issues around housing, with no offers made by the deadline that the government promised. People offered housing in high-rise blocks with no lifts, out of the borough, away from their communities and away from their families. The public inquiry and consultation over the summer have been riddled with multiple failures. Of 3 meetings, 2 were not in the community. There were no interpreters, no counsellors. They were disorganised. There was a lack of empathy for people visibly distressed. I had to hold the hand and comfort a woman who was weeping and traumatised throughout one of the meetings, and one of the inquiry panel members shouted at attendees to be quiet. The community have repeatedly raised concerns that the scope of the inquiry is too narrow and that there needs to be a diverse expert inquiry panel and team of advisors. It has also come to light that local residents and survivors were unaware of the deadline for core participant status because of the inconsistency of communications and lack of language services needed. Those impacted need proper specialist support, which is brought to them without requiring navigation of bureaucracy. The true extent and impact of the fire is to be known, then there needs to be a full immigration amnesty, not just the 12 months offered by the government. All voices of those impacted must be heard, and all impacted deserve justice. But justice takes many forms, and a good start will be urgently responding to the well-being and essential needs of survivors and families who've lost loved ones, permanent housing that meets individual needs, and the public inquiry going forward must also address the underlying causes of the fire, the impact of cuts, discrimination, neglect, health and safety, housing inequality and gentrification. There needs to be accountability, and justice in all its forms must be served. There needs to be investment in workers in the public sector, in social housing, and the government needs to stop the cuts. There must never be another Grenfell. And to end, the impact of the fire will have a lasting impact on those who experienced it. And like the survivors of Hillsborough and families, our solidarity will be required long term, not just in the immediate aftermath. Justice for Grenfell, please support.